If you grew up in America, you probably remember the same picture. A long wooden table, pilgrims in tall hats, native people in soft buckskin clothing. Everyone smiling. Everyone is sharing food. Everyone is at peace. It is a warm scene, a hopeful one, a story we tell our kids because it feels simple and good. But here is the truth. The real events behind Thanksgiving are not simple, and they were never safe. The world that produced that famous feast was shaped by fear, hunger, disease, political danger, and two societies struggling to survive each other. The real story is not a children's tale. It is a story of power, a story of loss, a story of a fragile peace that held together for just a moment before everything fell apart. And once you hear what really happened, you will never see Thanksgiving the same way again. Let's begin. Every November, we retell a version of the past that feels warm and balanced. According to the usual story, the Pilgrims arrived in a new land, struggled, found help, and then celebrated a harvest feast with their native neighbors. It sounds neat. It sounds fair. It suggests everyone understood each other. But this version of the story hides more than it reveals. It skips the fear on both sides. It skips the deep cultural misunderstandings. It skips the political danger that filled the early days of Plymouth. So let's clear our vision. Here is what the world really looked like in 1620. The Pilgrims were not wealthy settlers. They were not soldiers. They were refugees who wanted to escape religious pressure in England. When they boarded the Mayflower, their goal was simple: find a place where they could live out their beliefs without fear. But when they arrived in the northeast of America, nothing matched their plans. Winter hit early. Their food spoiled. Sickness spread. Graves filled faster than they could dig them. By the first March, more than half the colony had died. They were not building a new society. They were trying not to disappear. On the other side of this struggle stood the Wampanoag. They were not the noble helpers from children's books. They were a proud nation with villages, farms, diplomacy, and long memories. And they had just survived something almost impossible. Between 1616 and 1619, a strange sickness swept through the region, likely carried by European traders. Entire villages vanished. Some towns lost as much as 9 out of every 10 people. The Wampanoag were fighting for survival long before the Pilgrims ever arrived. Both groups were wounded. Both were afraid. Both needed something from the other. And this is where the story of Thanksgiving really begins. What most people don't realize is that the Pilgrims' arrival on the Massachusetts coast was not a surprise to anyone living there. Word of European ships had spread through tribal networks for decades. Indigenous people had already experienced traders, fishermen, and explorers, some friendly, many hostile. The Wampanoag had heard stories of enslaved people being taken from their lands. They had witnessed the patterns of European contact in other regions. When the Mayflower appeared, it was not the first ship these people had ever seen. It was simply the one that stayed. The Pilgrims arrived with religious conviction and a desperate hope. They believed God had led them to this place. But they also arrived with profound ignorance. They did not understand the seasons. They did not know which plants were edible. They did not grasp the complexity of the political world they were entering. Their survival was never certain. In fact, by most reasonable calculations, they should have failed. The only reason Plymouth Colony lasted past that first brutal winter was because someone from a society they were taught to fear, decided to help them. The feast we remember today did not start with kindness. It started with fear, strategy, and a desperate need for allies. The Pilgrims were frozen, starving, and completely unprepared. They needed help just to see another spring. The Wampanoag had strength, but they had been weakened by disease and faced rival tribes who might take advantage of that weakness. They needed a partner. Their leader was a man named Massasoit. He was wise and careful. He understood the stakes. If he chose wrong, his entire nation could fall. If he chose well, his people might recover. So when the Pilgrims settled on land that once belonged to a wiped-out Wampanoag village, Massasoit watched from a distance. He followed their movements. He judged their intentions. He knew they were weak. He also knew weak people could become dangerous if they felt cornered. But he sensed something else. These strangers were not like the fishermen or traders who came and went. They planned to stay. And that meant the Wampanoag needed to decide something important. Should they confront the English? Or should they try to use them as partners in a dangerous world? At this moment, a man named Tisquantum entered the story. Many know him by the name Squanto, but his real life was far more tragic than any schoolbook. He had been kidnapped by Europeans years earlier, forced across the ocean, sold, freed, and finally brought home to discover his entire village wiped out by disease. He spoke English. He knew European culture. And he saw what the Pilgrims did not. He saw how desperate they were. Tisquantum helped Massasoit form a plan. Approach the Pilgrims. Offer peace. Create a treaty that might hold back danger from rival tribes and give the Wampanoag breathing room to rebuild. For the Pilgrims, this was nothing short of a miracle. They received advice on farming, fishing, and survival. They received an alliance with a powerful leader. They were shown food sources they did not know existed. But every part of this relationship was political. Every handshake carried risk. Every promise mattered. The alliance between Massasoit and the Pilgrims was not born from mutual admiration. It was born from mathematical necessity. The Wampanoag Confederacy was fragile. To the south and west were rival tribes, the Narragansett, the Pequot, who sensed weakness and opportunity. If Massasoit could align himself with the English settlers, he could project strength without fully committing his own depleted forces. The Pilgrims, meanwhile, were literally dying. They needed food, knowledge, and protection. Massasoit could provide all three. Tisquantum's role was even more complicated than history usually tells. He was not just a helpful interpreter. He was a political operator navigating between two worlds, each with its own agenda. He understood what the Pilgrims represented, both the opportunity and the threat. He knew that European settlement could change everything. Yet he also knew that the Wampanoag, weakened by disease, needed every advantage they could find. The treaty they eventually signed, sometimes called the Treaty of 1621, was actually a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. It established the terms of peace, promised mutual defense, and set boundaries for land use. But underneath those formal words was a deeper, messier reality. Both sides were gambling. Both sides believed they could control what happened next. Both sides were probably wrong. And when the famous feast came, it was not because everyone was friendly. It was because the world around them was so dangerous that peace was the only option. By the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims had survived one growing season. They wanted to celebrate. They wanted to show gratitude. They also wanted to fire their guns in the air as a display of joy, and maybe a little pride. But gunfire is a strange way to say thank you. The sound traveled across the land. Wampanoag warriors heard the noise and believed Plymouth might be under attack. Massasoit responded fast. He arrived with around 90 men, armed and ready. This moment is the part of the story that almost no one hears. The famous feast began not with an invitation but with alarm. When the warriors reached the settlement, the misunderstanding became clear. But diplomacy is a living thing. No one wanted to lose face. No one wanted to risk the peace. So instead of leaving, the Wampanoag stayed. They brought food. They hunted deer. They joined the celebration. For 3 days, these two nations sat near each other, ate together, watched each other, and tried to make sense of one another. There were smiles. There was tension. There were moments of connection and moments of confusion. It was not a single meal. It was more like a long test of trust. The Pilgrims thanked God for a harvest. The Wampanoag thanked no one at all. They did not see this as Thanksgiving Day. For them, it was a political gathering that kept the peace. No one at that table believed they were creating a tradition that millions of people would reenact centuries later. What we don't see in the paintings and textbooks is the reality of that gathering. 90 armed warriors plus the Pilgrim colonists, plus the few Wampanoag who had been living near the settlement. This was not a relaxed family dinner. This was a tense political summit. Every gesture carried meaning. Every meal was scrutinized for signs of respect or disrespect. The food that was shared, corn, beans, squash, wildfowl, deer meat, was not just sustenance. It was a language. In the diplomatic world of the Northeast, the sharing of food meant something. It meant recognition. It meant alliance. The three-day gathering revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of the alliance. There were moments when genuine connection seemed possible. Massasoit and the Pilgrim leaders could communicate through translators. They could laugh together. They could share stories. But there were also moments when the vast gulf between their worlds became clear. The Wampanoag hunted using methods developed over thousands of years. The Pilgrims were learning. The Wampanoag understood the intricate politics of regional alliances. The Pilgrims were still figuring out where they even were. And beneath it all was a question neither side could fully answer. Could this work? Could two such different people truly share this land? The harvest that made this feast possible was itself a product of Tisquantum's intervention. He had taught the Pilgrims to plant corn in the native style, with fish buried in the soil as fertilizer. He had shown them where to catch eels. He had guided them through a landscape they did not understand. Without his knowledge, his language skills, and his willingness to bridge two worlds, there would have been no harvest to celebrate. There might have been no Plymouth colony at all, because the peace built that day would not last, and the collapse that followed would turn the Thanksgiving myth into something almost unrecognizable. For a while, the treaty held. There was trouble, but there was also cooperation. Gifts were exchanged. Disputes were settled. Both sides tried to honor the fragile trust they had created, but trust is fragile for a reason. New waves of English settlers arrived. They wanted land. They wanted more control. They did not share the Pilgrims' early vulnerability or their willingness to compromise. The Wampanoag watched their world change faster than anyone could respond. Their land shrank. Their political power weakened. Their culture came under pressure. Their patience ran out. After Massasoit died, his sons inherited a world far more hostile than the one he had managed. His younger son, known to the English as Philip, saw his father's alliance with the settlers as a mistake. He believed the English would never stop expanding. He was right. What followed was a war so brutal that even today, most Americans never hear about it. King Philip's War became one of the deadliest conflicts per person in American history. Villages burned. Families were taken. Hostages were traded. Soldiers fought with terror in their hearts. Entire communities disappeared. By the end of the war, both sides were scarred beyond recognition. The Wampanoag nation was pushed to the edge of survival. English settlers gained the upper hand, but at a terrible price. After all of this loss, after all of this harm, the memory of the peaceful feast began to fade. It did not vanish, but it became a quiet story, buried under layers of pain. The transformation from alliance to warfare took only a few decades. Massasoit's death in 1661 marked a turning point. He had managed the relationship with careful diplomacy, always walking a line between cooperation and resistance. But the conditions that made his strategy necessary had changed. The English were no longer a small, desperate colony. They had grown in numbers and confidence. They had established towns up and down the coast. They had secured their own food supply. They no longer needed the Wampanoag in the same way. King Philip, Metacom in Wampanoag, was a different kind of leader than his father. He watched the English expand year after year. He saw settlers taking more land, pushing the Wampanoag further inland, restricting hunting grounds, and demanding that native people convert to Christianity or face legal penalties. He saw his people losing their independence, their territory, and their way of life. He concluded that coexistence was impossible. When King Philip's War erupted in 1675, it was devastating in ways that few Americans understand. The war lasted 14 years. It involved not just the Wampanoag, but dozens of tribal nations. Entire towns were destroyed on both sides. Thousands died. The proportion of the population killed was staggering. In some areas, nearly a third of all people died. This was not a distant conflict or a minor skirmish. This was a comprehensive struggle for survival and control of the land. The peace that Massasoit had built through careful diplomacy did not simply fail. It was shattered by the weight of colonization itself. The English arrival had changed the landscape fundamentally. The demographic explosion of English settlers, the diseases they carried, technology they possessed, concepts of land ownership they insisted upon, all of these transformed the world in ways that no treaty could contain. By the end of King Philip's War, The Wampanoag Confederacy was broken. Survivors were scattered. Some were enslaved. Some fled to distant lands. The world that produced the Feast of 1621 had been destroyed. And yet, nearly 200 years later, that simple feast would be reborn. Not because of history, but because America needed a story to believe in. For a long time, Thanksgiving was not a national holiday. Different states celebrated it on different days. Many people did not celebrate it at all. That changed because of one woman. Sarah Josepha Hale was a writer and editor who believed the country needed a shared day of gratitude. She thought a national holiday could bring families together, and maybe even calm political arguments. For decades, she wrote letters to governors and presidents asking for a single national day of thanks. Most ignored her. Then came the Civil War. The country was falling apart. Entire regions were at war with each other. Families were split. Cities were burning. President Abraham Lincoln saw value in Hale's idea. In the middle of the bloodiest conflict in American history, he announced a day of thanks. He hoped it might bring a little unity to a broken nation. That was the moment the modern Thanksgiving holiday was born. Not in 1621, not around a shared feast, but during a war that threatened the very future of the country. Over time, the story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was pulled into this holiday because it offered a peaceful origin story. It made Thanksgiving feel older and more heroic. It made people proud. But the deeper truth did not disappear. It stayed inside the story, quiet, but undeniable. Thanksgiving is not a tale of perfect friendship. It is a reminder that peace can be fragile. It shows what happens when people who are struggling choose cooperation instead of fear. It also shows what can happen when that cooperation collapses. It is not a simple story. It never was. It is a story of human beings. Brave, scared, hopeful, and imperfect. And maybe that makes it worth remembering even more. What is remarkable is how durable this invented tradition became. Within a generation, Americans forgot that Thanksgiving was a relatively new holiday. They forgot that it had been created during a civil war for political purposes by a woman and a president who were trying to hold their country together. Instead, Thanksgiving became ancient. It became foundational. It became the story of America itself. Thank you for watching. If this story changed the way you see Thanksgiving, let me know in the comments. If you want more deep history like this, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next story. And wherever you are watching from, I hope your Thanksgiving is filled with understanding, reflection, and gratitude for the real, complicated, beautiful, and painful history that brought us to this moment. See you in the next video.